same-sex unions and the changing face of religious politics. One of the benefits of going relatively late on this panel is being able to hear and tie in some of the things that I'm going to talk about with the two folks who have gone before me. The paper that I'll present points to another kind of usable past, though what it's useful for is certainly debatable, and one that I'll offer some comments at the end. So this paper attempts to place the current marriage politics into a different kind of historical context to answer the puzzle question that have been asked by so many LGBT activists: why marriage? The answer to that question, I think, requires wrestling more seriously with the religious history of LGBT organizing. A history obscured often by polarized depictions of LGBT opposition to Christian right, anti-gay politics. And so one of the questions I ask is what happens between those two faces that often dominate media portrayals of LGBT politics. And I'll also say that the term I'll use in my paper is gay, since it was, instead of LGBT, I think the trans issue needs to not just be folded into this as if it's already included. So, to put Proposition 8 into a different historical context, I'd like to shift attention from the now iconic image of gay and lesbian couples overflowing from the San Francisco City Hall to look for a moment on a less known side of activism. The place, the Community Theater in Sacramento, California. The date, January 16, 1999. The novelty here was not the number of couples whose unions were being officiated. The novelty, rather, was the number of ministers. There were 95 of them, most of them United Methodist, with another 71 officiating in absentia. They were there to conduct a Holy Union service for two women, L.T. Charlton and Jean Barnett, who stood on the stage of the Community Theater in matching purple sweaters, flanked on either side by colorfully vested clergy, who, at the culmination of the ceremony, laid their hands or stretched out their hands on the two women to declare their union blessed by God. The United Methodist clergy, present as officiates, infamously dubbed the Sacramento 68, conducted the ceremony as an act that they called ecclesial disobedience. They were protesting the recent judicial decision by a United Methodist tribunal in Nebraska that had revoked the ordination credentials of a minister who officiated a commitment ceremony for two men. Jimmy Preach was his name. The Sacramento 68 answered to a less conservative Methodist jurisdiction, then did their defunct colleague, and the appointed investigating committee ended up deciding not to subject them to discipline. In a press statement about this decision, the bishop, Melvin Talbert, commented on the committee's decision. He emphasized that it should not be understood as a victory for same-sex marriage advocates, but rather as a more cautious permission for theological disagreement. He said, "In our denomination, there's room for diversity. There's room for a difference of opinion." This event is one of many creative ceremonial protests in the struggle for civil and religious recognition of same-sex relationships. Weddings offer the raw cultural material for innovative protests that have been used in both religious settings and secular arenas for activism around same-sex marriage. My comments today will consider these arenas, the civil sphere and the religious sphere, as overlapping sites for a marriage equality movement. I want to emphasize this overlap as a way to complicate the sharp designation often made by pro-same-sex marriage advocates themselves in the face of conservative opponents who insist that marriage is a divinely ordained, one man, one woman institution. They answer by insisting, often, in the words of one activist, this struggle is about civil rights, period. It is not about religion. Conservative religious leaders, they maintain, may continue to conduct ceremonies or not, as they please, whether those parties be divorced, impotent, or gay, to cite a few reasons that people might be barred on religious reasons from religious about secular aims as distinct from religion, it's also true that the church-based push for same-sex unions, as it's often termed, proceeds on terms a bit different than the counterpart civil rights struggle. So I want to distinguish these arenas and point to some of those ways that they're different, even as I'll look at the way they overlap. So these church-based advocates do not press for the rights of the couple, because there's no right religiously to the institution of marriage. Rather, they're pushing by and large for the freedom of conscience for the minister. As the protest by the Sacrament of 68 makes clear, clergy whose credentials are at stake are at the forefront of the movement, both as a matter of conscience and as a practical tactic. Despite these distinctions, there is considerable overlap between the secular and the religious arenas of activism for same-sex marriage. And this is where it's important to point historically to some of the religious themes, religious roots of LGBT movement organizing. One of the first couples to apply for legal marital status was married by the Metropolitan Community Church founder Troy Perry in 1970. Perry also officiated the protest that's often cited as a catalyst for the current marriage equality movement, the mass wedding held in front of the IRS building during the 1987 March on Washington. Perry again officiated a 1993 mass wedding and offered his spot in 2000 to Jimmy Creech, the defrocked Methodist minister that I mentioned earlier, whose trial inspired the Sacrament of 68. So Creech in 2000 officiated what's since been called the wedding, a mass wedding that have been held in front of the IRS building. The visible involvement of clergy from various faith communities as officiates at these and at other sites of protest, including the San Francisco City Hall, has made visible the support of faith communities for same-sex marriage. And I should also add that if Sarah Gordon had been able to present here, she would also be talking about clergy advocates' influence in litigation over same-sex marriage, particularly in Massachusetts. The current and past religious support in the fight for marriage equality points to a longer history of slow but dynamic processes of change in religious teachings and practices. Mainline Protestant denominations' debates over same-sex unions are part of this longer history of these denominations' increasingly heated liberal religious support for gay rights generally. So it's helpful. One thing my work does generally is to look at how the debates in mainline Protestant churches have overlapped with kind of different civil rights issues that have come up in same-sex marriage. Prior to the late 1970s, politicization of conservative Christianity, and specifically the Miami-Dade County Save Our Children campaign that touched off a wave of anti-gay citizen referendums in other parts of the United States. So prior to that, homosexuality was not an issue that conservative Protestants were mobilized around, whether